The 17 Years, Part 9. What follows now are several accounts and personal memories about Saint Annibale Maria di Francia. First account, Saint Annibale Maria di Francia and Luisa Piccarreta, by Father Bernardino Giuseppe Bucci. May he rest in peace. Aunt Rosaria would often and willingly speak of Saint Annibale Maria di Francia, founder of the Rogationist Fathers and the Sisters of Divine Zeal. She spoke of the Blessed as though he were intimately familiar to her, using the name Father Francia. I personally took great interest in this figure, and often asked the Rogationist Fathers if by chance there might be anything in the archives about the relations between Luisa and Saint Annibale. I even went to the Sant' Antonio Institute in Corato, a house which the Blessed had wanted personally, in order to move Luisa there to be with the sisters. My aunt told me that Father Annibale had conceived of the project of taking Luisa to the Institute of Sisters opened in Trani, but that Luisa had made him see that the Lord wanted her to stay in Corato. Father Annibale's project was implemented in 1928, after his holy death. Father Annibale di Francia was the extraordinary confessor of the little daughter of the divine will, Luisa Piccarreta, and it was he who published her works. Saint Annibale belonged to that array of priests who built up the Church of God with their holiness and their institutions for orphans and abandoned children. The work of these men was of great benefit to Italy and the Church, in a period when anti-clericalism was triumphant. According to Aunt Rosaria, the Blessed enjoyed the great esteem of St. Pius X, who willingly granted him private audiences. It seems that St. Pius X paid great attention to Luisa Piccarreta. Our Blessed submitted her writings to him before having them printed. Aunt Rosaria affirmed that after reading some of Luisa's writings, especially her famous work on the Passion of our Lord, published under the title L'Orologio della Passione, St. Pius X said to him, "Dear Father, you must read these writings on your knees, because it is our Lord Jesus Christ who is speaking in them." And it was the Holy Pontiff who urged Father Annibale to publish them. Father Annibale called on Luisa regularly at her house in Via Nazario Sauro, staying with her for several hours, conversing with her on spiritual matters. He often took some Italian or foreign bishop to visit Luisa, and my aunt remembers the visit of a prelate from Hungary. To dispel certain doubts, the Saint Annibale took several theologians to Luisa. Having spoken to the little daughter of the divine will at length, they would gather in another room for long discussions of what they had heard. My aunt recalls that one Hungarian bishop, after talking to Luisa, emerged from her room in deep distress and said the following words in his imperfect Italian: "Pray for my people." For Luisa had informed him of the far from rosy future that awaited his homeland. Aunt Rosaria could not tell me precisely who the bishop was, nor exactly where he came from. She only told me a Magyar bishop. I realized that he must have been a Hungarian bishop. Father Annibale did not only visit Luisa to talk to her, he gave lectures to all those who frequented Luisa's house, especially the young people. These lectures bore abundant fruits. Indeed, many of the girls became sisters. Many of the young men were initiated to the priesthood, and quite a few were admitted to his new congregation. Many people went to Luisa's house to confess to Father Annibale. This was confirmed to me by Canon Andrea Bevilacqua, who, as a young seminarian, would also go to Luisa's house to confess to Father Annibale, who was also the extraordinary and deeply loved confessor of Archbishop Leo of Trani. In my earlier publication, I did not mention Saint Annibale de Francia, because I was advised to say nothing, to avoid creating obstacles to his cause of beatification underway. It would be most interesting to consult the archives of the Rogationists and of the Sisters of Divine Zeal, where there must certainly be traces of the long correspondence between the little daughter of the Divine Will, Luisa Piccarreta, and Saint Father Annibale. My aunt told me that Luisa's spirituality was impressed upon the Institute's rule. It would be most interesting to read the Institute's old rule and constitutions. I hope, now that Father Annibale has been beatified by the Church, that the Rogationists and the Sisters of Divine Zeal will be able to reevaluate the little daughter of the Divine Will, Luisa Piccarreta, who contributed so much to their development with her prayers, her advice, and her writings. Much still remains to be said about the relations between Saint Annibale, the little daughter of the Divine Will, Luisa Piccarreta, and Saint Pius X, for whom Luisa had great veneration. At that time, she already revered him as a saint, and on various occasions said these words: "The Lord has given the Church two great pontiffs in these times. The first, a beloved son of Our Lady," with reference to Pius IX. "The second, a great defender of the faith and of the Eucharist." Saint Annibale de Francia had to overcome enormous obstacles in order to put into practice his plan to have Luisa taken to one of the houses of his congregation to be with the sisters. He often used to say these words: "The acceptance of Luisa in a house of my institute will be a blessing of God for the whole congregation." Indeed, although there were already two houses of the Congregation of Divine Zeal in Trani, with holy persistence he opened a female house in Corato, close to Luisa's birthplace. His project was not easy to implement. The holy founder died before the house had been completed. 2 years after his death, Luisa entered the house of the Sisters of Divine Zeal in Via della Morge. Second account: Rosaria Bucci's Memories, by Father Bernardino Giuseppe Bucci. Saint Annibale Maria di Francia paid frequent visits to the little daughter of the Divine Will, with whom he had long conversations, staying for hours in Luisa's little room, where he also often celebrated Holy Mass. This is what I remember of what Aunt Rosaria told me. In 1910, a priest arrived at Luisa's house and asked to speak to her. This was the first of many encounters between the two saints. Saints here, for our purposes, are put in quotation marks. That day, it was Aunt Rosaria who opened the door to him, then a young girl who had become familiar with Luisa's milieu, who had been visiting her for 4 years, and so collaborated with Angelina in the household affairs. Moreover, since Aunt Rosaria had mastered lace-making, she was acting as teacher for the other girls who were apprentices. She was also called by Luisa to set right her own work that was often defective, for the little daughter of the divine will was unable to pull the knots tight enough because of the stigmata hidden beneath her skin and a source of pain. Aunt Rosaria, on many occasions, prepared a little bed in a room in Luisa's house, on which Saint Annibale would sometimes rest, especially when he was a guest of the Piccarreta family for more than a day. The saint's stays in Luisa's house were dictated by the fact that before giving her writings to Father Annibale, she had to read through them all and provide explanations on doubtful or incomprehensible points. It was my aunt herself who gave Saint Annibale the manuscript of the famous book on meditation of the Passion. Saint Annibale had it printed with the name L'Orologio della Passione, a title about which Luisa was not at first enthusiastic. The publication, with a long preface by the saint, went into several editions, 4 to be precise. Aunt Rosaria remembered that Saint Annibale once urged all the girls and Luisa's regular visitors to read and meditate upon the work. In giving it to them, the saint said, "Before having the manuscript printed, I was received in audience by His Holiness Pius X, to whom I gave a copy. Several days later, having returned to see the Holy Father for matters concerning my new congregation, he said these words: 'Have Luisa Piccarreta's L'Orologio della Passione printed immediately. Read it on your knees, because it is our Lord who is speaking in it.' Since we have no other documents available, we cannot but trust the testimony of Rosaria Bucci. Account number 3. Saint Annibale and the Capuchin Friars of the Monastic Province of Puglia, by Father Bernardino Giuseppe Bucci. It seems that the Franciscan Fathers, and particularly the Capuchins, suggested to Saint Annibale that he place his works under the protection of Saint Anthony of Padua. It is certain that there was a deep reciprocal esteem between Saint Annibale and the Capuchins. I personally heard a lot about Saint Annibale Maria di Francia from our older fathers. Father Annibale published Luisa's writings, many of which were given to our friars, whom he warmly commended not to disclose the author's name to anyone, since the devout writer wished to remain anonymous. The Capuchin friar who had the most to say about this was Father Isaiah from Trigiano, who was simple and humble, the figure of an authentic priest. This father had a deep veneration for Luisa Piccarreta, and jealously preserved her writings and a few objects that had belonged to the little daughter of the divine will. Among these was a holy card, with a picture on which a prayer had been written by Luisa in her own hand. Father Isaiah often used to say, "Luisa is a great saint, and Father Annibale another great saint, because he enabled us to know her. Saints understand one another. It is God who brings them together." In far-off 1917, Father Isaiah from Trigiano was a Capuchin student at our friary in Francavilla Fontana, where on several occasions the friars gave hospitality to Father Annibale Maria di Francia, who was establishing one of his works in nearby Oria. These are Father Isaiah's impressions of Father Annibale. He was a priest who truly belonged to God, and at the sight of him, we students would gather round him with great sympathy. We all went to him for confession. He had an unusual appearance, as well as an unusual manner of speech and gestures, always moderate, and with a reserve that did not command fear, but filial trust. He constantly spoke to us of God's will, and exhorted us to bear with hardships and contradictions. He told us that a soul who was consecrated entirely to God was suffering and praying for us all. This soul, Saint Annibale said to Father Isaiah, is a daughter of your region, and this is a sign that the Lord is blessing the people of Bari. To comfort him in his doubts and sufferings, he gave him l'Orologio della Passione that he himself had printed. Father Isaiah, a Capuchin student at the time, asked him where this holy soul lived and who she was. But Father Annibale answered, "Just think about preparing yourself properly for the priesthood, and always doing God's will, and in due course you will discover who this soul is." Father Isaiah became a priest, went to see Luisa Piccarreta, from whom he sought advice, and not infrequently, comfort in his apostolate, threatened by malicious gossip. At that time, the monastic province of Puglia was passing through a difficult period because of various disagreements between the two provinces of Bari and Lecce, united in a single monastic province. Certain fathers headed a reform that was blocked by St. Pius X. The majority submitted, but others resisted and ended by being expelled from the order and excommunicated. One of these was Father Gerardo, superior and director of the studentate of Francavilla. This father had extraordinary ideas about running the students' community with a draconian discipline. He frequently left the students fasting because they had to mortify themselves and resemble the crucified Christ. The worst thing was that he did not even allow them to study. Their studying was to consist of the crucifix and penance. He consequently placed in the students' rooms a large crucifix and a scourge. It is easy to grasp the state of mind of all the students, many of whom fell ill. Father Annibale di Francia, on one of his visits, called Father Gerardo and made him understand that young men who were still growing could not be treated with such a regime. And he himself set the example by taking a great many provisions to the friary and begging them to eat their fill, at least sometimes. Father Annibale was very sensitive to the young students' health, and would often say to them, "This is not God's will." It seems that Father Gerardo was not totally unmoved by the exhortations of Father Annibale, who could speak with such conviction and love that he had an impact on even the hardest of hearts. In fact, the results were immediately noticed. Books were bought for the priestly formation of the young men, and slightly larger portions of bread and soup began to appear. Shortly afterwards, Father Gerardo left the order and was excommunicated for his bizarre ideas and his rebellion against the Church. Saint Annibale's words came true. Indeed, when the despairing students knelt at his feet for confession, he would often say, "Continue to live God's will intensely, because in a little while everything will change. Courage." Many fathers were in contact with Father Annibale, and through him became acquainted with Luisa. How is it possible to forget Father Daniel from Trigiano, a splendid figure of a Capuchin, a man who was a true little flower of St. Francis? Still today, his simplicity, his words, and his acts live on throughout our monastic province. Father Daniele spoke of Luisa Piccarreta as though she were a heavenly creature, and when, as a young seminarian, I went to his room for confession, he always said this to me: "Are you Bucci from Corato? Did you know Luisa? You should know that she is a great saint, and you should never stop praying to her if you want to be a priest." Father Daniele was the historian of Trigiano, and also published several devotional manuals, drawing heavily from Luisa Piccarreta's books. The way he spoke of Luisa suggests that he was in direct contact with the little daughter of the divine will, and with Saint Annibale. I also heard the following fathers talk a lot about the little daughter of the divine will, Luisa Piccarreta. Father Giovanni de Bellis, who was frequently invited to Corrado to preach, went to Luisa's house on these occasions. Father Giovanni, my confrere in the community of the Friary of Trinitapoli, when I was superior and parish priest, often spoke to me of Luisa Piccarreta and Saint Annibale Maria di Francia, whom he had known personally. I had the good fortune to be present at Father Giovanni's last moments. This father died while he was completely immersed in prayer, his hands joined, the beads of the rosary between them. His last words were, "May God's will be done." It was 1982. Father Terenzio from Campi Salentina also deeply venerated the little daughter of the divine will, Luisa Piccarreta, and would talk of her every time he met me. It was he who told me that the beatification cause of Father Annibale, Luisa's confessor, had been initiated. When I was a young novice at the Friary of Alessandro, Father Terenzio was superior. One day he offered me this testimony. There was a period when I was going through a crisis in my faith, and one day I went to Luisa, who listened to me kindly. She clarified all my doubts and gave me such clear and profound theological explanations that they were a revelation to me. All the doubts that my theological studies had not clarified were dispelled by Luisa. There is no doubt that Luisa had the gift of infused knowledge. Father Guglielmo from Barletta, one of the most distinguished priests of the province, who had several times been Minster Provincial and was rector of our theology center for students, spoke one day, during a lesson on ascetics, of Saint Father Annibale and his works. He spoke at length of L'Orologio della Passione and of the book Maria nel Regno della Divina Volontà. Referring to Luisa Piccarreta, he said, "She is a great and marvelous soul. We are not even worthy to be her fingernail." Father Guglielmo did not tell me whether he had known Luisa personally. Almost all our older fathers had direct or indirect contact with the Saint Annibale and Luisa Piccarreta. Among them, those to be remembered are Father Zaccaria from Trigiano, several times provincial. Father Fedele, from Montescaglioso. Father Giuseppe, from Francavilla Fontana. Father Tobia, from Trigiano. Father Antonio, from Stigliano, who left some writings on the little daughter of the divine will. Father Dionisio, from Barletta. Father Arcangelo, from Barletta, also provincial. Father Pio, from Trajano, provincial. Father Gabriele, from Corato. Father Timoteo, from Aquarica, a great friend of Luisa's last confessor, Father Benedetto Calvi, in whose parish he often preached. He also assisted at the translation of Luisa's body from the cemetery to the church, and concelebrated at the Mass in the main church for the opening of the beatification cause of the little daughter of the divine will, Luisa Piccarreta. Father Salvatore, from Corato, of whom I shall speak in a separate chapter. Many lay brothers who went to Corato to beg for alms never failed to visit Luisa. Fra Ignazio, Fra Abele, Fra Rosario, Fra Vito, and Fra Crispino, all who often spoke to me enthusiastically of Luisa, whom they greatly revered. Account 4. A most outstanding episode by Father Bernardino Giuseppe Bucci. I had always heard tell of a young man who had been killed and was restored to life by Luisa. I had heard the story told by the old blind singer in the upper room of Via Panzeri. One day a young man was found dead, lying on the ground in a pool of blood. When his mother heard this fatal news, she did not rush to see her son, but ran, howling and disheveled, to Luisa's house, where she knelt on the doorstep crying, "Luisa, Luisa, they've killed my son." The holy little one, as the singer called Luisa, was moved and said, "Go and fetch your son. The Lord is giving him back to you." The mother was helped to her feet and accompanied by a few devout persons to the place where her son lay dead. At the sight of him, ignoring the police, the mother flung herself on the body, cradled it in her arms, and kissed it desperately, like the sorrowful Mary at the foot of the cross. But suddenly the young man opened his eyes and said, "Mamma, sto non piange," meaning, "Mother, I'm here, don't cry." On hearing this story, the whole gathering was in tears, especially the older women whose sons were serving in the war. Sometimes, though in hushed tones, I even heard this story told in my own home. I remember Aunt Rosaria addressing my father with these words, "Don't start talking such nonsense. Concentrate on eating your food." My father had, in fact, been telling the story of the man brought back to life by Luisa the Saint. In my parish, I once heard Miss Reda, minister of the Franciscan Third Order, speaking of this miracle to a group of women. When she became aware of my presence, she immediately put her hand to her mouth, regretting her imprudence. Indeed, the parish priest, Father Cataldo Tota, who was present, said, "Certain things should not be said in public, while those concerned are still alive." I never attached much importance to this episode, always spoken of in hushed tones, because it seemed incredible to me. Aunt Rosaria never wanted to discuss the matter. Whenever I asked about it, she would answer, "Leave that nonsense alone." I realized that talking about the event was totally forbidden, both by Luisa and by the clergy. It seemed to me that the story told by the blind old man was too fantastic, too embellished, and sounded more like a Greek tragedy than an event that had actually occurred. I never previously wanted to write anything about it, so as not to make a laughingstock of the little daughter of the divine will, Luisa Piccarreta. And I was also convinced that this episode was merely the fruit of popular imagination. Later, having read a letter by the Saint Annibale Maria di Francia that speaks of the miracle of the resuscitation of a young man who had been killed, I thought it appropriate to mention here the phenomenon about which I had heard so much. Saint Annibale confirms, bringing to bear all his authority as a saint, that it was due to Luisa Piccarreta's prayers that this young man was restored to life. His letter is dated May 5th, 1927. A few days later, on June 1st, 1927, Saint Annibale died serenely in the town of Messina. At the bottom of page 72 of the booklet, we see a beautiful picture of Luisa Piccarreta in her bed, reading a volume from the Book of Heaven. You have reached the end of the 17 years, Part 9. Fiat.